Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Hello, and welcome to Brave New World, a data governance network production sponsored by the Omidyar Network. Brave New World examines the transformation of humanity in the post-COVID era. The key driver of this is technology. Today's episode is about the US-China war. Now, historically, when we think of war, it's with guns and tanks and airplanes, which are the weapons of war. But in the internet era, tech is the new battlefront. The US-China war is largely about control over the internet platforms of the future. But what's at stake? Well, one thing's become quite apparent in the last couple of years. Digital platforms powered by data and artificial intelligence increasingly operate the economy and our lives and influence public discourse. These platforms collect vital data about us, including our identity and more details about our activity. And where goes activity, there goes human attention to digital platforms. If I can have more of your attention, I have more influence over you. At scale, that's worth a lot. The platform war is about influence. Joining me today to make sense of the brave new world of internet platforms in the US-China war is Arun Sundararajan, a leading thinker in this space. Arun is particularly well known for his award-winning and best-selling book, The Sharing Economy, which is the most enlightening and enjoyable read. Arun is professor at the Stern School of Business at NYU. Arun, welcome to Brave New World. I'm delighted to have you on the show. But before we talk, tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you a New Yorker? Where'd you grow up? What's happening in your head these days?
Well, I'm delighted to be on your podcast, Vasant. I'm really glad that you've started this. I mean, over the years, you've certainly changed the way that I think about digital technologies and their impact. So I'm glad that you're sharing this expertise with the world. Whether I'm a New Yorker or not, it's a tough question. I'm an immigrant, right? And so home is a foreign country. I've lived in New York longer than I've lived anywhere else in the world. And I've lived here for a long time. So I guess that does make me a New Yorker. I certainly feel a kinship with the city, and especially this year, as you know, we've seen us shut down in April and May, and then starting to see the city bounce back a little over the last few months. That bond certainly feels stronger. I've been thinking about a lot of things. I've been thinking about the future of capitalism, and that's very closely connected to the evolution of platforms. I sort of feel we're in a phase of correction. We went through one of these phases after the stock market crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s, which, at least in the United States, sort of beefed up our social safety net. We feel like we went through another correction after the 70s, with the new wave of neoliberalism and the Reagan-Thatcher years. And 40 years later, I feel with over the next few years, depending on what happens with the various antitrust cases that are being brought against the platforms, and depending on how these platforms are reshaped by both sort of user push and government push, I think we'll redefine, whether we are going to be in a much more free markets kind of capitalism, or whether we're going to be in a much more heavily regulated kind of capitalism.
That's really interesting, this notion of corrections, because we certainly do seem to make our share of mistakes inadvertently. Technology seems to throw up all kinds of surprises that we hadn't envisioned, when it came into existence. So let's start with, the beginning of the internet, because we were there to see it, prior to the internet and the beginnings of the internet. The internet was supposed to be an open thing and empower individuals. I recall this 90s cartoon of two dogs staring at a screen and one saying to the other, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. How things have changed. Not only does Facebook know you're a dog, it even knows your stripes and knows how many, what you want, what you like, and it knows more about you in many ways than you know about yourself. It can predict all kinds of things about you like no one can, including yourself. Now, if you think in terms of the government and the individual and the corporate as being sort of the three entities within society, how has this power distribution changed since the early days, of those two dogs talking on the internet? And how has COVID, while we're talking about that, how has COVID impacted these changes?
Yeah, totally. I think Facebook knows that I'm not a dog for sure. It also knows a lot about my dog, given the number of dog pictures that I post on Facebook. And so there's certainly a tremendous wealth of knowledge that the internet has about each of us. I certainly think that the short answer to how has it altered the power distribution between governments, platforms, and the individuals over the last 20 years is that power has shifted to the platforms. There's really no doubt about this. If you look at Amazon in the 90s or eBay or early days of Google, and you look at the power calculus between them, say the Clinton administration in the United States, and the individual, platforms are far more powerful today than they used to be. Now, it's not clear that this is necessarily a bad thing. And, I'm being a little I'm pushing against the grain here because it's become fashionable these days with that Netflix show, The Social Dilemma, and all of the government action against the platforms, to think of platforms as these big, bad, evil corporations that have, sort of taken a stranglehold on our lives and are sort of sucking in all our data. And I don't necessarily subscribe to that point of view. They are more powerful, but this is in part because individuals and governments have given them more power. Some of this has been voluntary and intentional. That is, I actually know that I am educating Facebook about my dog preferences, and I'm doing it willingly. I'm not doing it under coercion. I'm giving up information about myself in exchange for whatever Facebook gives me. And similarly, governments around the world have handed Facebook and Google a host of responsibilities instead of taking them on themselves. They've handed them responsibilities about censorship. Governments don't censor really as much anymore in most, democratic societies, the US and Western Europe. They leave that to the algorithms of the platforms. They've handed over a whole bunch of identity and trust capabilities that governments have traditionally held, which now platforms hold. I mean, I could go through a long list of things that have de facto been handed over to the platforms. So I feel it's a mistake to sort of point at the platforms now and say, hey, I mean, you've become really powerful, because, their response is, yeah, sure, we have, but you let us, and you gave this to us. Now, that having been said, there are some questions on the data ownership and privacy front where perhaps the choices haven't been quite as intentional. Maybe we haven't really been aware of the extent to which we've been giving up our privacy. But you also asked about COVID, which is an interesting twist in this steady progression, because I think there's been an acceleration here away from the individual. If you think about it, we're much more reliant on platforms for our interactions in general now. Over the last 6 months, we teach on Zoom, you and I as professors, we shop online, we have meetings online, we are much more reliant on Uber Eats and DoorDash for our food. And so the extent to which these platforms have become a part of our lives has certainly increased dramatically. And similarly, the extent to which a state actor, a government, can use information about its citizens in the, sort of towards, the social goal of contact tracing or stopping the spread of COVID or, keeping the economy open, that power has also increased, right? And these things have a tendency of not coming back. once you hand over this kind of power to a government, it's unclear whether after the crisis has passed, the government says, okay, fine, we're going to stop tracking you. And so we may have just sort of moved the reference point for a lot of people on that government individual equation on the privacy front. And, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I guess the jury's still out. I think over the next 20 years, we're going to see how governments treat the information that people give them, and whether we should stick with our premise that if a government monitors its citizens more, this is bad for the citizens, or whether, this new generation of 21st century governments realizes that you can both monitor your citizens and, not have them give up too many sort of civil liberties.
Just help me through that, because on the face of it, that sounds like a contradiction, right? Yeah. How can you achieve both of those things simultaneously? How can you have that information where you're monitoring as well as preserve privacy? So, for example, if we take the case of South Korea, which has been incredibly successful in dealing with the virus, I mean, to some extent, the incentives of individuals and the government have been aligned when it came to that. And they've been quite successful at it. But, that's an example, I guess, of a case where individuals have willingly given up their privacy in exchange for the larger social good. And the bargain is quite clearly defined. And I can see why it would make sense. Whereas in other areas of human activity, the picture seems to be much more nebulous, right? Because you can, and we see this in platforms, right? They are able to predict all kinds of things that we can't even begin to envision. And the ways in which that can be used is a little troubling, isn't it? So I just want to come back to how do we strike this balance between the social good and preserving individual rights? And I ask this because I've proposed some steps myself in this arena towards transparency. And, I know that, your position for the most part has been let these platforms figure out how to do this themselves, because their long-term incentives are sort of more or less aligned with ours. So I've said, I guess I've said a lot, pick up any of those pieces.
Totally. I think that it's a tough question, and I'm trying to sort of think beyond our present frameworks, which, as you rightly point out, say that, well, as the citizen gives up more information to the government or to the platform, as the case may be, and, these lines between platforms and governments are blurring, something that I hope we can sort of chat about in a bit, that it's bad for the citizen and, in many ways. So the fact that we have both platforms and governments sort of on the stage right now, and both of whom are getting data from individuals potentially, I think changes the balance and changes the dynamics of the individual state sort of information sharing and the individual platform information sharing in the following way. If you think back to 40 or maybe 30 or 40 years ago, when Ken Loudon, our colleague, was writing about privacy, all of that was situated as a problem between the individual and the government. Those were the early privacy concerns, right? The individual versus the government. And the assumption was that once the government has the information for one purpose, there are no control mechanisms that can prevent it from using it for other purposes. And also that, once the government has that sort of information, there may be sort of some other successor government who uses this towards nefarious ends. And finally, that, the act of collecting this information or the act of being observed was going to change your behavior. I think what's happening now is that there's a much greater awareness among people that platforms are taking more and more information, or that we're giving more and more information to platforms. And as we're sort of handing over more information and also sort of more societal responsibilities to platforms, yes, I believe that eventually the solution to, like, what does the governance of a platform look like and where are the lines drawn cannot come from any other place except from the platforms, maybe in conjunction with other people, because they just can sort of see the future better. And because there isn't a powerful enough government to be able to dictate to platforms exactly what they do. But I also think that people are going to be looking to the government as sort of the mediator here, as the entity that says, here's where we draw the line. So citizens over time will start to see the government as their ally in sort of drawing the right lines for privacy. And governments will then have the opportunity to say, okay, I've collected your data for the purposes of contact tracing, but I can put technology in place that will guarantee to some extent that this is the purpose for which this information is going to be used. Now, that kind of guarantee isn't easy to do if this is information that is sitting in a file drawer somewhere. But we've got much more sophisticated ways of sort of drawing a circle around what can be done with data. And, I think back to 10 years ago when I was, working with Nandan Nilekani in India and their team on India's, national ID system, the blueprints of that. And, the vision there was that certain information would be collected by the government, but would only be used for sort of identity verification purposes. And thus far, if I look sort of 10 years down the road, I mean, they have put a system in place where this identity verification system is used for identity verification. It didn't immediately spill over into sort of every other arena of government activity. And part of it has to do with technological protections or technological safeguards. And so if I look forward 20 years to this equation where citizens might be saying, well, I'm happy to hand over this information to the government because the government is my ally, because, you've also got platforms out there that aren't sort of duly elected and in the social contract supposed to be sort of taking care of the collective good. They're taking care of their own profit motive, but also because the government has demonstrated and technology exists that give me some sense of guarantee that the property rights that I'm handing over when I hand over my data are not sort of blanket or exhaustive. They are sort of targeted at a particular set of things that the government can do with this data.
So that's a great point, actually. And I like this idea of the individual and the government incentives being aligned for certain kinds of things. And I believe it's possible because, there's all kinds of processes that governments must follow. And so there's sort of an expected transparency around what the government says it will do and what it'll do. I guess the situation is different with platforms, right? Platforms are not saying anything about what they're going to do with the data. And so to me, it seems like, one way to get the incentives aligned is to just require greater transparency from platforms. And, one of the analogies that I always like to draw is, with financial services, where a regulator can walk into a financial services company and say, show me everything you've done, every transaction, every message to a client, a potential client, right? You're required to keep it all, right? Now, the regulators aren't saying, we're going to look at this information all the time. They're just saying, just keep it because we might want to look at it later, right? It seems to me that, and I've proposed this myself, that maybe the way to move towards trust with platforms is not to monitor them, but to tell them that, hey, we realize that you can't tell us all the things you're going to do with information, but we'd like to know how you operate. Just have some operating transparency and trails of things that you've done, so we can go back later and analyze it and be able to ask questions that potentially affect society that we're unable to do at the moment because they just operate under this veil of secrecy, and no one knows what the hell is going on inside these platforms, what the algorithms do all day. So would that be a way to achieving, more trust with these digital platforms, is just to ask them to make their operations transparent, to make their algorithms transparent?
I think it's sort of an intriguing notion, and I like the idea of it's sort of the the credible threat theory of regulation, which I don't know if this is a real theory or whether I just sort of made that up right now, but it's the idea that the government's actually not going to act. So the government's actually not going to break up Google, but they're going to pose a credible threat to do so as a way of inducing change.
Exactly.
So, but in the same vein, the prospect of being audited changes behavior in the way that society wants, right? I can certainly see some benefits in an approach like this. I've often sort of during the time that I was spending a lot of time thinking about regulating the sharing economy and sharing economy platforms, I would often recommend that platforms set up APIs that they then gave the government as a way of convincing a government that self-regulation was the right path, that you sort of do the regulation yourself, but you provide an API so that at any point in time, the government can go in and, has the ability, and these won't be used very often. But I also think that over the next few years, we're going to see the conversation around data property rights start to intensify. And the reason why I think this is because, historically, we've had much stronger property rights frameworks that sort of govern how the split of ownership of something is in every successful market economy and every successful capitalist economy, right? And, this solves so many problems if we clarify that this is the kind of ownership that an individual has when they sort of generate data of a particular kind. And I'm not advocating that it be blanket ownership. I think that, much like copyright law has certain sort of divisions of rights that, you get when you buy data or when you buy a song, when you buy a book, that it's sort of tenuous where because of the nature of the good, not one person can own it completely. It's sort of jointly owned, and we just have to sort of draw the lines of who owns what and who has what rights. And so in many ways, I kind of like GDPR for that reason. I don't like the exact sort of terms of GDPR. This is the European Union sort of privacy regulation from a couple of years ago. Not because I agree with the sort of the elements of it, but because it starts to put in place a regulatory framework that imagines that individuals have some sort of property right over the data that they generate. And because once you put that property right in place, you don't actually have to create an elaborate regulatory structure around it. In some ways, the market will take care of a lot of things. In the same way that in centrally controlled economies, if you have to decide exactly who gets what and how production occurs, it becomes incredibly complicated and it generally doesn't work. On the other hand, if you assign sort of property rights to people for what they generate and you allow for private property, then the allocation, while not ideal, sort of takes care of itself through market forces. And so in many ways, I feel that the regulation of data and the extent to which, what are platforms doing with your data? What are your algorithms doing? Sort of KYC type things like you've seen in financial services may end up being you may end up getting the same kind of outcome that you get if you simply ascribe some ownership to the individual over the data that they generate.
So you've really said a lot there, and
yeah, that's one of my problems. I've never been known for my brevity. This is always a problem on podcasts.
So let's peel apart some of the things you said, and you mentioned India's approach, and you mentioned Nandan Nilekani and the whole Aadhaar platform.
Yep.
And sometimes I wonder whether those are some of the benefits from being late entrants into the game. That is, the US sort of went with this ad model very early in the game, whereas I think in India, the thinking around the internet has been somewhat different. There's this notion that people have of like a public digital infrastructure that I've never heard talked about in the US, right? In the US, it's sort of Wild West. It's an ad model, do everything you can to maximize profits in any way possible, as long as you're not doing something blatantly, I don't even know what the word for it is, but just some blatant
society, yeah.
Right. I mean, you're just behaving very badly, just sort of stay within the limits of acceptable behavior and maximize profits. Whereas I think India's taken a different approach. I mean, the Aadhaar platform that you mentioned does just one thing, which is, are you who you say you are? Like, it's an authentication platform, and it does something that simple. And India sort of thought about building a stack on top of that, where you ascribe, where people can give permissions and rights for things to be used, especially data. And that sounds really good. I mean, it sounds really good to me. I see it fraught with its own problems. But that's sort of one of the benefits from being a late entrant. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is it the case that the US, having gone down this sort of ad model, now is saying, Jesus, there were some disadvantages to this, and now we need to rethink rights and permissions and things like that to make this less of a Wild West place and, more sort of consent-driven, or rights, as you're calling it, more rights-driven. I'm calling it consent-driven than it is at the moment. But to me, how you get there from here just seems to be really thorny. And I see lawmakers sort of struggling with this problem as well. Right? How do we get from this current Wild West to something more orderly and more trustworthy?
Yeah, I think we should just sort of look to history and see how we got from the actual Wild West to where we are. And it was a combination of collective action and government action and, sort of like a credible threat of regulation. So, but, to the point about India, there's certainly benefits to being a second mover here and to trying to learn from either the missteps or from the where people have ended up in other countries and, in what is a different direction that we might be able to go in. And, I personally think that Aadhaar, the ID platform, was really visionary and unique and, one of those examples of leapfrogging, like creating something that was simply better than anything else anywhere else in the world because, back in 2010, 3 out of 10 households had someone who had like portable ID. And, this was sort of a really bad place to start from, but it meant that you could sort of imagine a 21st century solution, sort of relying on driver's licenses or social security. But if you look at India's sort of current approach to a public digital infrastructure, again, I see elements of that credible threat of regulation philosophy there. Because if you think about, something that happened recently where the Indian government was toying with the idea of setting up its own app store. This was sort of this was under discussion. Let's, free ourselves from the iPhone app store, the Apple sort of app store and the Google Play Store, high commissions or high rates of commission. And instead, let's perhaps maybe operate our own. And, this was an interesting line of thinking in the context of WhatsApp and TikTok being banned in the United States and TikTok being banned in India. Because, in order to actually enforce a ban on an app, you need the cooperation of an app store, right? You can't do it. Like a government can't simply say, I ban this app. I mean, they actually need the app store to take the app down. And so there's a very different sort of power equation there. And that might have been part of the thinking. But then you look at China where they don't have a Google Play Store, and there's a lot of fragmentation in the Android app market. You've got the Samsung App Store, you've got the Huawei App Store, you've got the LG App Store, and it feels sort of inefficient. And so, to me, the ideal outcome for India is, while they pose this credible threat of setting up their own app store, the app stores react. And Apple has reacted in the United States to, sort of a move by some game makers to try and set up their own app stores by slashing commissions from 30% to 15% last week. And now 15% commission is sort of at the point where, you're not going to get enough of a critical mass of app developers to say, well, it's worth our while to set up our own app store to bypass this. And so you might sort of see, the strong Indian government saying, we're going to set up our own public digital infrastructure. We believe in sort of centralized ownership, or that whatever the elements of that could just lead to the kind of changes in the platforms that negates the need for this kind of infrastructure. And that's the self-regulatory solution, right? Where platforms sort of do the right thing, but they do the right thing in part because it's in their best interest, but in part because it's only in their best interest now because the government is sort of dangling this sort of hugely undesirable alternative in front of them.
Right.
The government probably knows is not going to be implemented. And so it's sort of a weird game of, it's a weird power game, right? Where, each side knows that, they're going to have to move. And nobody wants to actually sort of go to the, the worst case scenario. And so you end up in a better place than you otherwise would have been in.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It is this sort of power game. It's not chicken, but it's something resembling that, this credible threat. So you mentioned China and TikTok, and so let's talk about that, because this
totally, yeah,
this platform war that's happening between the U.S. and China. Let's make sense of it. Is it just pure nationalism, or does it make economic sense? What's at stake here? Is it better for China not to have U.S. companies on their turf and vice versa? Is U.S. just playing tit for tat with TikTok? Make sense of this for us.
Yeah, that's like a tongue twister, right? Tit for tat with TikTok. I think it's both, actually, and, we may be entering a phase where, at least for a little while, a little bit of protectionism on the digital front is also aligned with long run economic sense. And what I mean by this is that China has it has set up an environment that has nurtured the emergence of platforms like Alibaba, platforms like Tencent. And in part, this has happened organically because Facebook and Google don't have a significant presence or a presence at all in China, right? And so by erecting barriers and creating this place where Chinese platforms could then, sort of become multi-$100 billion companies by competing for the Chinese market alone, China has created giants on the global stage like Tencent and ByteDance's TikTok and Alibaba. And so from the US's point of view, I think this is just sort of, in many ways, a brave new world, right? Because for the last 50 or 60 years, the United States has gotten used to the idea that the leading technology provider in the world in any given space will always be a US company. This is sort of the way it's been from, the time of semiconductors and early computers and IBM, then Intel, then Microsoft, then, sort of the internet giants. All of them have, by and large, been giant American companies. And suddenly we're faced with the prospect of a couple of things. One is that Huawei is, in my mind, far and away ahead of the rest of the world in telecommunications technologies. They're sort of the unsurpassed leader in 5G technologies. They've got AI chips that are faster than NVIDIA's chips. They've got an R&D infrastructure in Shenzhen that is, sort of that I can't see any other company in the world replicating, because you can sort of design something, you can test it immediately because you're in Shenzhen, and that's where all the semiconductor manufacturing technology and prototyping technology is. And then you can take it to market faster. And so Huawei, I think, was the first big example to the United States of another country being the world leader, or having a company that was the world leader in a sector that was of great sort of global importance. And perhaps the US government sees WeChat as another player like that. And they certainly see TikTok. And TikTok seems particularly threatening to the US because not only is it, a platform that is now dominating video entertainment for teenagers, but it's not something under the hood like Huawei. It's actually a cultural product, right? And the US is not just supposed to be the tech leader of the world, they're also sort of the cultural leader of the world, right? I mean, our soft power has come over the last 50 years from, not just our technological dominance, but our cultural dominance. And so TikTok sort of showing up, I think, challenges this assumption that the United States makes. And I think where we are now, it is in a place of uncertainty. The Trump administration found it, aligned with their other sort of narratives to say, okay, let's ban TikTok. That sort of worked well for them, right? It was sort of a, hey, let's get tough on China. Let's sort of draw a line in the sand without thinking about the consequences. This sort of like, knee-jerk kind of seat of the pants, like, Trump decision.
But is it, right? Is it a seat of the pants Trump decision, or is it actually tit for tat based on an observation that, hey, maybe this protectionism thing actually makes sense, right? Maybe we should just sort of reconsider the sort of mantra that economists have been, pushing on the world for decades, about competition and, free enterprise and all that kind of stuff, that maybe China actually, maybe they're better than us, the US at 5G, right? And maybe they're better because of the way they went about doing it. Maybe protectionism is good. Maybe they're actually going to weaken us if we allow them here, right? So maybe it isn't a knee jerk. Maybe it's actually very rational, and that protectionism makes sense because, hey, it worked in China, so maybe it'll work here as well.
No, I get it. I agree with you in part. Certainly with where you started, which is that the world is reconsidering unfettered free trade for certain as like, sort of the best way for everybody. And again, this sort of was the late 70s, early 80s reaction to the 1970s and that most recent big adjustment of capitalism, right? Like that neoliberal, sort of wave of change. And certainly, I think over the next 10 years, we will have alternative theories put forth to unfettered free trade that, sure, there are plenty of them, that start to gain some global traction. What I mean, though, is that the action of saying, let's ban TikTok, is a particular choice, right, on the protectionism spectrum. Saying that unfettered is one thing, like, let's, in 3 weeks, sort of get everybody to stop using this and ban it completely is another extreme. And, it could be seen as sort of a proportional response, a symmetric reaction. China has banned Facebook and Google, so let's ban their stuff. But, to me, it's not clear that this is the right move for the United States. Certainly something that reconsiders free trade. And you reconsider free trade as a country when you're on the receiving end of the downside of it, right? You certainly don't reconsider it when, you're the country benefiting from it. And, I think it's going to be really hard, though, to sort of get to a point where you can, in fact, stop the sort of the growth and dominance of platforms from another country. So China did, China's blocking Facebook and Google certainly allowed China to create its own sort of world-class platforms, but it didn't prevent Facebook and Google from becoming the dominant platforms around the world, right? And so in the same way, I think the US blocking TikTok, if they actually sort of go forward with it, and it's much harder in the United States to block TikTok than it is in China, right? Because we have sort of a multi-layered, multifaceted, governance system that where a president can't simply say, hey, let's ban this. There are courts and there are other sort of forms of recourse. But I don't think that it's going to be easy to, if the goal of the United States is to sort of either slow or to thwart China's eventual dominance in other tech areas, the way, like, we've seen it happen with Huawei, banning their apps in the United States is not necessarily going to be the strategy that works. And I see it as one extreme of what should be a continuum between free trade and absolute protectionism. And my belief is that there are sort of middle grounds that can protect US interests while not completely sort of preventing Chinese apps from operating in the US.
So what's that middle ground going to look like, right? So if you were talking to lawmakers in the US today, who are dealing with this complex landscape of issues around its own platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, right? We've seen 2 hearings in the last 2 months, aimed at, better understanding and controlling and gaining more transparency, right? So we're dealing with that very significant issue. And then, China at the same time, and trying to craft a policy that balances, national interest and free trade. What's that actually going to look like? What does the blueprint for that look like?
Well, China now has dominant tech companies that will continue to grow their dominance around the world. I mean, the last 4 years have certainly dramatically increased China's influence on the world stage as sort of the United States was receding. And so it's impossible for me to imagine a scenario where the Chinese tech companies aren't going to continue to sort of on their path to dominance in sort of like, around Asia, certainly sort of in the African subcontinent, perhaps even parts of Europe. I think the middle ground could involve, not just tit for tat. You blocked my platform, so I'm going to block yours. But negotiation that has to do with, hey, like, here is my portfolio of dominant. So there are 2 parts to it. One is, here is my portfolio of dominant tech companies that are American. There are yours that are, from China. Yours operate sort of unfettered in my country. Mine can't operate at all in your country. Let's think about sort of growing the pie on both sides. Because we also have to remember that Apple is deeply dependent on China, right? I mean, they are the biggest American, probably the biggest company in the world apart from Aramco. They're sort of a pride of like, sort of American capitalism, sort of dominant force on the world, but they have a very deep dependence on China, both from a manufacturing point of view, and China is their biggest market. And so sort of saying, well, let's see if we can move the needle a little on the presence of our companies in your economy. Like, what's important to you? If certain kinds of sort of social interaction and information seeking are important for you, China, to have done through your own platforms, that's fine. What are the areas that we can carve out where you loosen restrictions on American tech companies? And in exchange, like, we will not go down the path of going to this extreme of, sort of banning TikTok and WeChat. But I think a second component of this has to be really to keep this in mind as sort of regulators are like, barreling down on the American companies themselves. Because while China has a sort of a very substantial sort of regulatory apparatus, there's a very close connection between speed of innovation and rapid progress and the government platform nexus, right? I mean, like, the Chinese government over the last few years has been dramatically trying to accelerate innovation on platforms and AI through a national strategy. And so their regulations on their platforms aren't meant to hamstring or fetter the platforms. They're meant to maintain the appropriate power balance between the governments and the platforms. Whereas the United States, its regulatory sort of strategy towards the platforms doesn't seem as clearly defined. And if it has the unintended consequence of making the platforms less competitive compared to their Chinese counterparts, this will sort of end up having a counterproductive effect if you take sort of the US-China sort of battle for tech supremacy into consideration as well. And so formulating, because I read the 450-page, I read parts of the 450-page document that the Democratic congressional leadership put out about sort of regulating the platforms. When I say I kind of read it, it's sort of like Piketty's book, Capital, right? The 600-page book. Everybody's kind of read it. Nobody's actually read the whole thing from start to finish. Or Marx's Capital. We've all kind of read this. And so everybody's kind of read that. And it's an intelligent document. And it shows that the Democratic congressional leadership actually understands antitrust law. But, it's lacking sort of centralized leadership in some sense, where this is our strategy for protecting here are our objectives. And here are how these objectives make sense in the broader context of not just the United States, but the US versus China. And I haven't seen that as yet. And I think that's also an important part of thinking about this battle for supremacy between the US and the China, what we do on the domestic front. Because China's certainly not putting any roadblocks in front of its platforms as far as their global competitiveness goes.
No, just the opposite, in fact. As you said, in fact, the landscape you painted is a really interesting one, where you're saying that the Chinese state and the platforms are actually working hand in hand. And so industry and government is working hand in hand to actually fund and innovate in the area of AI. And so there's and the process is set up to accelerate innovation while we're sort of dealing with issues about how to regulate platforms, which could potentially make them less competitive. What I also heard you say, when I asked for sort of where the middle ground is, I think what I also heard you say is that China has to, I guess, also make a move, sort of make some sort of a good faith move in terms of coming up with or helping create a situation where the pie is larger for everyone, right? So, and my question is, can they actually do it, right? Because they've exercised a tremendous amount of power and centralized control over the internet. And I guess that image has suffered negatively globally, right? There's this feeling that, there's such control exercise that, you have no idea, where your data will end up. There's a lack of trust when it comes to Chinese platforms. And, even though there may be no evidence to this effect, there's just this sort of, feeling that, should we really trust them? So, and this has sort of become like partly a propaganda war as well. And I think I heard you say earlier that, or at least imply, but maybe you weren't, and I just read it, that China must actually also make some moves towards a more conciliatory, situation where there's, where the pie is bigger. And my question is, can that happen? And, or is it wishful thinking?
Well, if you think about China and its tech sector today compared to, say, 10 years ago, and 10 years ago was sort of when Tencent was still relatively small. Alibaba was sort of a decent size, but these companies have had the last 10 years to sort of grow into global leaders within the Chinese economy and then expand out. China's in a much better bargaining position now than it was, say, 10 years ago, right? I mean, they're sort of sitting at a very different place vis-a-vis the United States in terms of almost sort of sitting at the same table. They've got their tech giants, we've got our tech giants, we've got more still, but they've got more VC going into sort of tech giants. They've got more perhaps sort of a greater pace of sort of tech innovation than we do potentially. And so I think they're in a position to actually they've got the ammo now to be able to sort of sit down and negotiate from a position of greater equality, which wasn't the case 10 years ago, right? Where the US platforms were simply sort of much further ahead. And so, it like the negotiation would have been, okay, let your platforms into my country, and sort of they will then go on to dominate, right? That's no longer the case. So I think that yes, they are in a place where you can in fact find a middle ground, especially now with Biden's election. We're also in a place where we will return to traditional diplomacy and hopefully sort of repopulate the State Department and sort of get back onto sort of the playing field that is more familiar. But we'll be doing it with the backdrop of the last 4 years and the prospect of a 2024 Trump run, right? And so I think the next 4 years are a really good window for sort of the traditional machinery of sort of trade negotiation to work. And hopefully tech will be sort of front and center in the US-China trade negotiations. It won't just be about tariffs on physical goods. So I've always been sort of a glass half full kind of guy, right? And so I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic with reason. It's because China and the US, like the power imbalance on the tech front between China and the US is very different today than it was 10 years ago. So they can actually negotiate as equals.
Sounds like a situation that is highly unpredictable, isn't it? I sometimes draw this analogy that, in sports, when, if a league achieves parity, then, outcomes become random and completely unpredictable. And so I guess my takeaway from that is that, given this sort of, close to parity situation between the US and China, who the hell knows which way it's going to play out. But maybe I should ask you that as someone who's got their glass half full. What makes you optimistic that this will lead to good outcomes as opposed to, the ones envisioned by Einstein, which he sort of eerily described?
Yeah, well, I think it's because sort of collectively humanity wants to survive, right? And, historically, there's always been this control mechanism that brings us back to the bargaining table eventually. And so, I think that there's enough sophistication on both sides of the table to realize that, as technology becomes an increasing part of geopolitics, not just on the are your teenagers being entertained by my platform? But when you enter things like, sort of AI-driven autonomous weapons and, the sort of the darker side of sort of technology being a bigger and bigger part of geopolitics, I think where, in the glass half full mentality makes you think that that same sort of control mechanism that has sustained humanity over hundreds of years will kick back in at some point and get people to sort of come up with treaties, to come up with sort of solutions that are negotiated rather than sort of race to the bottom kind of kind of competition where eventually you might end up in Einstein's world.
I like that. One of our colleagues, Bob Cavish, once said something that stayed with me. He said the world belongs to the optimists.
Yeah.
So I've always...
2020 may not be the best year for that, but on the other hand, the optimist is always looking forward to things being better, right? And so if I'm enjoying little things about New York today that I never enjoyed last year because after being locked down for 2 months, you suddenly sort of have an appreciation, and so maybe shifting the reference point in 2020 through the pandemic does sort of make the world, belong more to the optimist because there's so much more to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. And as I often say, true dat. So
yes.
On that note, Arun, thank you for being here and for that fascinating conversation and exchange of ideas.
Always a pleasure, Vasant.
Thank you.